Good afternoon. Welcome to the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. We also offer the opportunity to take a single course without having to pay an entire semester's worth of tuition cost. One can also audit such a course at a much less cost. If you are interested in learning more about us, please feel free to speak to one of our staff at the conclusion of this event. This discussion is a part of IWP's China series. J. Michael Cole is a Taipei-based senior fellow with the Global Taiwan Institute in Washington, D.C., senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, senior fellow with the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Nottingham, UK, associate researcher with the French Center for Research on Contemporary China, assistant coordinator for the International Coalition for Democratic Renewal-Forum 2000 China Working Group, and chief editor of Taiwan's Sentinel. He is the author of 5 books. His latest, Convergence or Conflict in the Taiwan Strait, was published by Routledge in fall 2016. He is currently writing a new book on cross-strait relations since 2016 to be published in July 2019. Before moving to Taiwan in 2005, Mr. Cole was an analyst with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in Ottawa. He has a master's degree in war studies from the Royal Military College of Canada, a bachelor's degree in English literature from Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, the International Diploma in Humanitarian Assistance from the Center for International Health and Cooperation, Fordham University, and CX77 Peacekeeping from the Lester B. Pearson International Peacekeeping Center. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Mr. Cole.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. It's the first time that my entire biography is read prior to one of my speeches. It's kind of long. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome here. I'm glad to be here. I feel like I've been giving the same talk all week. This is the 5th engagement that I've had since Tuesday, talking on that particular subject. I apologize if there's anyone in the room who's been to a previous speech. Some of that might be a little bit familiar, but I'll try to be original and innovative as well, so that you're going to remain engaged in all that and not fall asleep. Okay, so basically I've been asked to talk about Chinese influence operations, particularly targeting Taiwan, but also as it pertains to activities outside of Taiwan. This is a subject that I have been researching since I moved to Taiwan back in 2005, but more consistently or intensely since I would say 2013 or so, when a famous gangster returned to Taiwan after spending about a decade in China, and his name is Zhang Anle, also known as the White Wolf, who is a former head of the Bamboo Union triad in Taiwan. And Mr. Zhang had spent a decade in federal prison in the United States on drug trafficking charges, and also had been involved indirectly in the assassination of Henry Liu in San Diego back in 1983. So his return to Taiwan and the fact that he had created a political party called the China Unification Promotion Party while he was in China, and was able to come back to Taiwan as a former most wanted individual, was arrested at Songshan Airport and released on bail the very same afternoon, whereupon he started advocating for unification and basically one country, 2 systems in Taiwan. And they had little blue booklets that they would distribute to whomever they encountered. So his presence in Taiwan and his involvement in Taiwanese politics really compelled me to start looking into that particular organization, but also to extend my research to different groups, NGOs, civil society, and other political parties in Taiwan that were playing a role in pro-unification activities. And it's like, using the old analogy, it's peeling an onion. The more you look into these things, the more layers you discover, more participants, and then you start doing link analysis and trying to see who's talking to whom, where they might be getting their funding, prior affiliations that they may have had in China, for those of them who had spent time in China. And then looking, of course, in open source, trying to see, which activities, conferences, forums, exchanges that they are taking part in. And surprisingly, for a country that is supposedly, intransparent, there's a lot of material that can be uncovered in open source. And there's a lot of photographs and articles written in simplified Chinese, so that you can start, drawing a picture of these individuals and the roles that they're playing and who they're interacting with. And then you start identifying some of their Chinese counterparts, several of whom have had a background in intelligence and now were supposedly retired and working on cultural and trade and other interesting areas. So that's the reason why it went from a hobby to one of the main subjects of my research in Taiwan. And now the notion that this is a new phenomenon, obviously, when it comes to Taiwan, is dead wrong. This has been going on since forever. We have, however, seen an uptick or intensification in these types of activities, obviously, since President Tsai, when came into office in May 20th, 2016. She is from the Democratic Progressive Party, which is a much more China-skeptic party that has drawn certain lines when it comes to Taiwan's sovereignty and democracy. But even before that, when Ma Ying-jeou from the Kuomintang, supposedly Beijing-friendly Kuomintang, starting in the early months of his second term, is a time when the Chinese Communist Party already started to realize that they were not able to get from the Kuomintang what they were hoping to obtain towards unification. And the reason being very simple: the KMT, for all its faults, also operates in a democracy and realizes that it needs to answer to the demands and expectations of the public. When they went over those lines, as in March 2014, they were confronted with the Sunflower Movement, which occupied Parliament for 23 days over a controversial services trade agreement with China. That was a couple of months before the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, and there was a lot of cross-pollination between the two movements as well. So that got Beijing very worried, and that's when we started seeing activities that basically sought to bypass central government authorities in Taiwan. So again, I repeat, it's important to realize that these activities did not begin or even start intensifying under the DPP, but even before that under the KMT. Soon afterwards, some rather prominent retired PLA individuals started telling the Chinese media that they had completely lost faith in the KMT's ability to work towards unification. And one of them in a conference basically said, KMT is an unreliable partner. All they do when they come on visits to China is drink our wine, eat our food, and then they go back home and they do absolutely nothing that we were expecting them to do. So, which basically has compelled the CCP to try other means by which to work towards unification with Taiwan. Of course, there were the sticks and carrot approach. They banked on ideology. They banked on economic determinism by promising riches for companies, individuals, and municipalities that were agreeable to working with Beijing. But then eventually they also realized that that in and of itself was insufficient to convince the Taiwanese to win their hearts and minds. So all of this was also combined with military coercion, so intensification in military exercises, simulations of amphibious assaults on Taiwan, PLA Air Force, PLA Navy activity near and around Taiwan, as we saw earlier this year, crossing the median line in the Taiwan Strait in a deliberate act, the first time since 1999. So basically, it's a multifaceted approach to Taiwan, and all of this, again, they realize is not succeeding in getting Taiwan anywhere near where they hope it's going to be. And in reality, all trends within Taiwanese society are pointing in the opposite direction. So self-identification as Taiwanese has been rising, support for unification has been dropping, and it's also a generational thing. So the younger the members of the population in Taiwan, the less inclined they are to support China, even though a large number of them are willing to go to China to study or work because that's where the opportunities are. They're being pragmatic. So which basically leads me to the subject of my talk today, which is political warfare or active measures or sharp power, depending how you want to call these things. It is the newest component in China's overall strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan, and basically it operates around 6 main pillars. The first of which is an attempt to corrode, bypass, manipulate democratic institutions, elections, and public trust in those. Second one is to undermine the morale of the targeted society and weaken resistance to Beijing's objectives. Third one is to sow confusion in Taiwanese society. The fourth one is to co-opt elites, business people, politicians, retired military officers, civil society, and the media. The fifth one is to coerce the regime's critics and opponents in Taiwan and outside Taiwan. And the sixth one is more in line with psychological warfare, and it's to exacerbate feelings of abandonment, isolation, and inevitability. All of this, especially under the Taiwan government, is meant to balkanize or atomize Taiwanese society in its body politics, and to bypass central state institutions, especially but not limited to the current, thanks for joining us, current administration, and to directly capture local politicians, municipal leaders, grassroots, agricultural and fisheries sectors, tourism, land development, and to create associations with counterparts in China. So there's, for example, the Tainan Cross-Strait Exchange Promotion Association and the Cross-Strait Taiwan Guangdong Exchange Association. If you start looking at these organizations, you quickly realize that the people behind those are the same gangsters / pro-unification types that have been calling for one country, two systems. The earlier conference this week, I was asked by a lady, well, isn't that normal that you would have, given the cultural affinities and all that, that you would have direct interactions between municipalities? And my response was, absolutely, it's natural, but the main difference here is the fact that the organizers are actively agents of unification work, and they're involved with organized crime and all that. So that's certainly an interesting layer in these kinds of activities. Then we've seen, again under Tsai, but even before, the weaponization of trade. So they're basically bypassing municipalities that are governed by politicians that the CCP does not like. So those tend to be either independents or members of the DPP. Basically, what they tried early on in the Tsai administration was to weaponize tourism and to deny tour groups the rights to travel to certain municipalities that were governed by the DPP. Conversely, municipalities that were governed by KMT or independents who are in favor of closer ties with Beijing would be rewarded by larger groups of tourists, as well as purchasing delegations from China, buying food products and fisheries and flat screen TVs and whatnot. Mostly we're recognizing or rewarding municipal leaders who acknowledge the so-called 1992 consensus in One China principle, as Beijing phrases it. They have also rewarded these politicians by bringing them to Beijing on all expenses paid trips, where they get access to senior CCP officials and the usual briefing with Taiwan Affairs Office and other individuals. I mean, there's a lot of debate in Taiwan as to whether the overtly pro-unification parties should even be allowed to register. And that's a question that's been asked repeatedly. Some of us choose to regard this as a sign of Taiwan's democratic maturity, in that it can countenance the existence of parties that are actually arguing for unification with China. And others are saying that their activity should be regarded as treason, and that therefore they should not be able to field candidates in elections or even register their parties. That's an open question. But so there's a number of them, as I said, the aforementioned China Unification Promotion Party. There's also the New Party, which has been around for several years, and one that emerged recently around late 2015 is called the Taiwan Red Party, and all of them have been pushing the unification agenda. Now what the government is trying to do, especially with CUPP, is establish where their funding is coming from. If there is evidence that there is direct funding from Beijing, then that would render those parties illegal. But we've had raids by Ministry of Justice Investigation Bureau in the past couple of years, but we've yet to hear the results of those investigations. At the same time, these parties have also collaborated with a constellation of civic organizations in Taiwan. There's several dozens of them that are all also working towards a unification agenda, organizing events, protesting, holding rallies, managing Facebook pages and different groups on social media and whatnot. One of them is, for example, the Concentric Patriotism Association that is well known for raising the PRC flag outside Taipei 101 skyscraper and Ximending shopping area. Again, same debate, should people be allowed to wave the PRC flag in Taiwan? And the argument is that, well, it's their freedom of expression and all that. If they're not doing anything illegal, why should these individuals be barred from doing so? With that particular group, they also have the tendency to physically assault Falun Gong practitioners and Beijing critics. So then there's certainly an illegal component. And some of those individuals have been briefly detained for these kinds of activities, but the associations and organizations have been allowed to continue existing and operating. Other areas that are possible routes for CCP money into Taiwan, criminal activities, the fact that there's two main triads in Taiwan, the Bamboo Union and the Four Seas Gang, that run, underground gambling, casinos, prostitution, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and whatnot. Obviously, that gives them the ability to generate revenue. And now, what needs to be determined by law enforcement is whether some of that revenue is being channeled into pro-unification activities in Taiwan as well. We've had Buddhist temples, which are actually rather known for acting as conduits for Chinese money into Taiwan, and they're actually abusing laws. There's a blind spot in Taiwanese regulations where religious organizations do not have to declare make their financial reports public. So there's a huge blind spot. The great majority of incense that Buddhist temples use in Taiwan is produced back in China. So that again involves a lot of money movement, and they do send delegations back and forth to China as well, and oftentimes come back with printouts of notices by Taiwan Affairs Office. The local temple in my neighborhood came back with a brand new flat screen TV, and the moment they turned it on, for several weeks they were only playing CCTV and facing outside the temple, so that passersby would get that strong dose of CCP propaganda. Other areas is, we've been tracking some of the individuals, like from the new party and CUPP. They do travel overseas, and they have attended conferences in New York City and other places in North America. One of them last year by the New York chapter of the China Council for Promotion of Peaceful National Unification, and also sponsored by the U.S.-China Cultural Exchange Society. And interestingly enough, a few weeks after one of those individuals came back to Taiwan, a member of the youth branch of the new party, he and his father's residences were raided by law enforcement and discovered piles of cash money that were being used to try to recruit Taiwanese military personnel and to work towards unification for them as well. Now, whether that cash money came from his trip to New York remains to be seen, but there's certainly interesting connections there. And his father was actually in charge of a Buddhist temple as well, so they found very creative financing activities at the said temple. As I said, CUPP is often involved in violent protests and intimidation of civil society. Whenever under the Mao government you had senior Chinese officials visiting Taiwan, they would create their own protection for Chinese individuals, so a second layer of protection outside of law enforcement in Taiwan. Repeatedly would clash with Taiwanese civil society that were protesting those visits by Taiwan Affairs Office officials and others. More recently, both the Bamboo Union and the Four Seas Gang were involved in intimidation against Hong Kong democracy activists. So upon leaving Hong Kong at the airport, they were greeted by triads in Hong Kong, and then upon arriving at Taoyuan Airport in Taipei, outside Taipei, they were also greeted by these organizations and civic groups, and the son of the chairman of CUPP, the son of White Wolf, was there, physically assaulted individuals, was detained and eventually charged for physical assault as well. And that particular individual has been traveling on at least 3 occasions in recent years, traveling to Naha in Okinawa, meeting with his counterparts in Yakuza and organized crime there. And those visits seem to coincide with an uptick in protesting against military bases in Okinawa, advocating not for forced relocation, but for their removal outright and sending them to Guam. So there are signs of penetration by CCP in civil society in Okinawa, and with a direct link to organized crime, pro-unification types in Taiwan. I raised the issue with Japanese friends in government, and they were, as usual, quite mum. So I don't know if they're aware of this, but they're certainly not sharing any of their findings with us. Another note on Buddhist temples as well. There was in April a major religious freedom forum held in Taiwan that was co-sponsored by the US State Department and Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they invited Uyghurs and Tibetans, and obviously 80% of Taiwanese society is Buddhist, so invited a lot of Buddhist temples to participate. And quite tellingly, not a single one of them chose to participate in the forum, which obviously became quite critical of China as well. So that's another telltale sign that Buddhist temples are somewhat in Beijing's pockets. Moving to the elections in Taiwan, which are very much in the news nowadays, since there will be presidential elections in January next year. The CCP, there's every indication that the CCP is now shifted to supporting outlier candidates. So either individuals who do not belong to any of the main political parties, or individuals who do belong to certain political parties, but are also outliers within their own party. Clear example of this, if you follow Taiwanese politics, is Hangover, who is the current mayor of Kaohsiung, who is very much a newcomer in KMT politics and has absolutely no relationship with mainstream or core KMT individuals, but he's riding a wave of populism that now positions him as a potential candidate for the presidential elections in January. And he has been saying all the right things when it comes to Beijing's preferences, and oftentimes his rhetoric tends to run in parallel with things that Beijing has been saying as well. So embracing 1992 consensus, he's been wishy-washy on whether one country, two systems would be applicable to Taiwan, when mainstream KMT has been very publicly stating that this is non-viable for the Taiwanese. And when a couple of months upon becoming mayor, he immediately went to Xiamen in Hong Kong and had a series of meetings with Taiwan Affairs Office and chief executive in Hong Kong and other interesting individuals. So do we have evidence that he's working on behalf of the CCP? Absolutely not. But there's certainly worrying signs that he would be willing to go well beyond what longstanding KMT would be willing to do with regards to cross-strait relations. So that raises the issue again of indirect funding for Beijing's preferred candidates, political parties, civil society, oftentimes also via Hong Kong. So holding companies in Hong Kong have been used to recycle money coming from mainland China. And regulations are such in Taiwan that you can get direct investment from entities that are listed in Hong Kong, but not from China. So that's another blind spot as well for attempted acquisitions of land, companies, and media organizations in Taiwan. Which puts the onus on the investment commission to do its job accordingly, but there were instances where they were failing to do that, and civil society had to step in to make sure that the proper reviews and oversight were carried out. Then moving on to propaganda, computational propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, fake news on social media and traditional media. Again, the aim here is to exacerbate the loss of faith in Taiwan's economy. So we've seen a meme emerge in recent years that basically refers to Taiwan as a ghost island, so Gui Dao. And it has been spread on line groups, on Facebook pages, on the famous PTT board, which is a kind of a BBS that's run out of National Taiwan University, very popular among young Taiwanese and political savvy young Taiwanese. And more that meme has been appearing as well. And it seems to have had some success in convincing a number of Taiwanese that the economy is not doing well, when in reality it's doing okay. It's certainly not doing worse than it was under a KMT government, when the government was recognizing 1992 consensus and had much better relations with China. So this plays again into the hands of candidates like the aforementioned Hog Warrior, who basically says we want to leave politics aside, we don't want to fight with China, we should simply focus on the economy. And he has presented himself very much as a Midas-style figure who would somehow magically revive the economy, not only for the Kaohsiung area, but now as a would-be presidential candidate for the whole of Taiwan as well. He also has been widely supported by retired civil servants who were affected by President Tsai's pension reforms. So again, there's that money element that plays into his hands. And at the same time, China is also not only positioning itself through propaganda as the destination for Taiwanese business activity, but also through a program known as the 31 Incentives, trying to attract young Taiwanese, educated Taiwanese, to go to China to start businesses rather than stay in Taiwan. So there's an effort as well to accelerate a brain drain in Taiwan, where oftentimes opportunities for young people are lacking. And China obviously offers many opportunities, especially in the high-tech sector. There's two components to this. There's a brain drain, but also the attempt to, I wouldn't say brainwash, but at least convince Taiwanese that they might be better off identifying as Chinese and basically supporting the unification program. Behind all these, there's a traditional media that obviously have been co-opted by the CCP. Chief among them is the Want China Times media group, which it was revealed earlier this year, has received since 2007 upwards of $495 million in subsidies from the People's Republic of China through its holdings company in Hong Kong. Now, in its defense, China Times Group has said, well, those are two separate companies. So the holdings company in Hong Kong is basically for its business operations across China, which are quite substantial, and that entity is separate from the media group. So that being said, that creates a bit of a problem for us, because we cannot claim that that investment is directly responsible for editorial decisions on the part of One China Times Group, which controls newspapers, TV stations, cable distribution, magazines, and other areas of online media. But there's certainly an interesting alignment of its editorial line with Beijing's objectives and preferences, as well as self-censorship on issues such as concentration camps in Xinjiang, the assault on Christian churches across China, crackdown on Falun Gong, and nowadays developments in Hong Kong as well over the extradition treaty. If you watch television in Taiwan in the past week, if you watch Zhongtian, so CTI TV, that is owned by the China Times Group, you will not see a single second of footage of what's going on in Hong Kong right now, which is quite revealing as well, when all the other media have been reporting on that quite substantially. China Times, most newspapers in Taiwan had these developments on the front page. China Times had an inside story, bottom left, and it was about this big on the page about what's going on in Hong Kong. And obviously it was adopting Beijing's rhetoric, basically accusing civil society in Hong Kong of being funded by Western elements such as the CIA and troublemakers and all that. And again, One China Times Group has been one of the major pushers for candidate Hog Warrior as well. You watch their television, normally the first 5-6 segments are talking about him and how great he's supposed to be for the economy. And you have other media like TVBS, another TV station, and then Far Eastern Television and newspapers, as I said, China Times, UDN, are all very much on the same page when it comes to candidates who are quite obviously Beijing's preferred candidates for the next elections. And with that comes censorship, disinformation, media concentration, acquisitions. There's also speculation, and it has yet to be proven, that in all restaurants, hospital waiting rooms, and other public spaces across Taiwan, operators have been given a certain amount of money every month to only play these TV stations. So what they're trying to do is saturate the environment as well with positive reinforcement of certain candidates. And Hog Warrior again went from someone that nobody had ever heard of to someone that 23 million people in Taiwan are constantly talking about. So there was this social engineering of someone who went from nowhere to being basically the supposed savior of Taiwan's economy. So there's interesting engineering going on there as well. The chairman of China Times Group is Taiwan's second wealthiest individual, has made billions of dollars in selling crackers and running hospitals and other businesses back in China. And he's for many years been involved in cross-strait media forums and owns a constellation of companies, some of which are listed in Cayman Islands, which also makes tracking finances quite problematic. Mr. Tsai has led 5 cross-strait media delegations to Beijing since 2015. The first year, there were 34 representatives from Taiwan, mainly from print and television. This year, in May, there were more than 70, and they widened the areas, so now it included print, TV, magazines, new media, film, distribution, and publishing, as well as a youth segment. And they were even greeted by the chairman of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, Wang Yang, who basically told them that it is now their responsibility to promote peaceful reunification, the so-called 1992 consensus, and one country, two systems formula. So again, whether all of this will shape the editorial lines of these media organizations remains to be seen, but certainly they were amenable to traveling to Beijing and hearing that kind of discourse. During the summit, we were also told that a number of collaboration agreements were signed by the organizations, but we have yet to figure out what those exactly were. One group has also been involved, as I said, in organizing cross-strait cultural forums that are used to indoctrinate participants and again reinforce the same means about shared destiny, one country, two systems, unification, and all that, and also attempt to co-opt participants. Partners at these events include a number of individuals who are known to have past connections with Chinese intelligence and United Front Work Departments, GPDLD, and all that. One of the main Chinese outlets that has been involved in those events is the China Energy Fund Committee, also Tomowachi, which has been in the news since 2017, because the head of their think tank in Hong Kong, Patrick He, a former Hong Kong official, was detained and arrested at the airport in New York City for attempts to bribe the Secretary General of the UN General Assembly. A few weeks later, the chairman of the energy company based in Shanghai, Ye Jianming, was disappeared in China. The company was nationalized on the orders of Xi Jinping, we are told. And Ye Jianming had made several visits to the United States, meeting different individuals, establishing connections with the Biden family. The first person that Patrick He contacted after being detained was Joe Biden's brother, who's a lawyer. And we know for a fact that CEFC had actively tried to co-opt former military officers, intelligence officers, including Jim Moseley, and to bring them to conferences in the United States where they would, again, talk about One China, as well as reinforce China's Belt and Road Initiative and ceasing arms sales to Taiwan and China's claims in the South and East China Sea as well. So by recruiting, if you will, participants who were formerly officials in U.S. government and other governments, it also lended legitimacy to their arguments by demonstrating that well-known figures in U.S. intelligence and military were also agreeing with China on these disputes. Again, whether that was effective or not remains to be seen. These companies also benefited from the fact that nobody really knew who they were dealing with. The assumption was that they were dealing with normal academics and think tank types, when in reality a good number of them were working on behalf of the United Front Work Department or had a past or connections with the intelligence world back in China. The fact that CEFC became news in the past couple of years now has alerted a lot of people in the intel community in the West, not just in the US, but also in places like Czech Republic, where they were very actively recruiting individuals, including the president, Miloš Zeman, and acquiring media organizations, breweries, soccer teams, and whatnot, so as to reinforce their influence on society. Over the years, CEFC had threatened to sue at least 6 individuals, journalists and academics worldwide, who were investigating their connections and the connections of their chairman Ye. I am one of the individuals who were threatened. I'm the only one who was actually sued in Taiwanese court, so that dragged for 2 years, which also now is part of the pattern where we're seeing more frequent recourse to lawfare or threat of legal action against whomever is investigating these kinds of connections. As a deterrent, I don't think they've ever won a single case in court, but that's not the point. My case was eventually thrown out of court as frivolous, but it cost me, legal counsel for 2 years, and now I'm a little bit reluctant to write about that particular company because I don't feel like going through this again, and it has implications for my family and all that. If they start doing that in smaller countries where these organizations are active, so that pretty much involves all of BRI, you will not have the same financial capacity to fight back, or institutions, democratic and all that, that can assist journalists and academics who are being threatened by the Chinese. So in that regard, I was lucky because I'm based in Taiwan. And we retaliate by giving absolutely everything to US intelligence. So that's how we fight back these kinds of activities. Now, the big thing nowadays, and that's a growing problem, is disinformation, fabrication. On Facebook, which has the highest penetration rate in the world, social media in Taiwan, line groups, which is a bit of a WhatsApp that was created in South Korea. We've identified dozens of content farms or content mills, which are websites that are operated by Chinese interests whose sole business is to generate and post disinformation with the hopes that that will be grabbed by traditional media and chat groups and create confusion and basically lead people in the wrong direction, oftentimes heavily criticizing the Thai government, raising controversies, using elements of the basis of truth, but then taking information in the wrong direction, and basically to force, to sow divisions and polarization within Taiwanese society, quite reminiscent of the kind of activities that we saw involving Russia in the 2016 elections in the United States. And what's going on in Taiwan right now is what has happened in the United States is that it's taking quite a bit of time for intelligence agencies to realize the impact of disinformation on social media, how they can track that behavior, whether it originates in Taiwan or back in China, and then how to counter these activities. So I've had several delegations from Western countries visiting Taiwan, all of them expecting that Taiwan has the solutions to countering these activities. They're not there yet. They're still in the phase of identifying the key nodes of disinformation and trying to come up with means by which to mitigate those activities. But that will take some time, and which is the reason why I think disinformation is going to play a major role in the presidential elections in Taiwan in January 2020. They've also been very good at penetrating other divisive developments in Taiwan, things like pension reform, as I said, but also legalization of same-sex marriage, which is now bringing together a bunch of conservative, mostly Christian organizations that are now also accusing the Thai government of undermining social stability by allowing gay individuals to get married. These groups now are all rallying around more conservative candidates who also happen to be supported by Beijing. So I think they've been able to use disinformation and other means to basically propel all these groups in the same direction so that you augment the opposition to Taiwan. We've had imagery disinformation as well, PLA Air Force using its official Weibo account to post pictures of Chinese bombers supposedly passing near Taiwan landmarks, including Jade Mountain. Again, that's psychological warfare meant to undermine belief or support for Taiwanese military and belief in their ability to counter Chinese encroachment on Taiwan's sovereignty. and also perhaps hope that the Tsai government would overreact and escalate and perhaps give Beijing opportunities to push back supposedly and defensively. There's also signs that we've seen worldwide that the Chinese are trying to split the pro-independence camp in Taiwan, like they've done with Uyghurs and Tibetans and democracy activists from China. Again, by providing financial opportunities for certain individuals back in Taiwan, such as buying large amounts of their books whenever they get published. And then they tend to start saying things that are a bit more pro-Beijing. Another current issue right now is the kidnapping of Taiwanese nationals who were supposedly committing crimes in China by promoting democracy. The famous case is Lee Minja, who was kidnapped a few years ago. Again, it is to threaten the Taiwanese, obviously, anyone who is a critic of Beijing, but also is a very effective means to put pressure on the government back in Taiwan by civil society that wants the government to be a bit more forceful in its response, but at the same time also reinforce notions that the Taiwanese government is incapable of standing up to Beijing. So that can also have implications for support for the current government, and also implication that the implication that Beijing would not behave in such a way if there were a government in Taipei that, for example, acknowledges the 1992 consensus. So this is another means by which China is now punishing its adversaries, and as we all know, they're now busy kidnapping Canadian nationals as well over a dispute over Hmong and Huawei. And there are other Taiwanese nationals who have been kidnapped, but those have not been made public, and that's the families requesting that it be handled behind closed doors. But that's certainly a growing problem, and with the extradition law in Hong Kong, that would now mean that possibly Hong Kong would be a no-go area for any Taiwanese who is deemed to have supported independence or have supported umbrella movement and all that. So that's quite troubling. Abroad, moving outside Taiwan, but still connected to Taiwan, many of the organizations that I've named earlier, primarily CEFC and others, the Renewal-Forum for Civilizations, they've all also been trying to reinforce notions that Taiwan should be abandoned, that doing so would improve bilateral relations with Beijing. Certainly the US is a major target of these operations. One of the key nodes of electronic, cyber, and traditional disinformation targeting Taiwan is Taiwan-based in Fujian province. Now there are indications that they are shifting somewhat their strategy and targeting more the United States than just Taiwan, and very much, again, aimed at convincing Washington to abandon TRA obligations and end military support to Taiwan in the form of arms sales. And then lastly, a few last points. I mean, a bit like the Russians, the Chinese have been very good at using democracy against itself and our democratic institutions to, exploit blind spots and foibles in our systems. We've seen repeated attempts by supporters of Beijing, mostly online, to create a moral equivalence. So basically, whenever the government tries to adopt measures or laws that would be necessary to countering these kinds of activities, then they face accusations that they're being authoritarian, undemocratic, and no better than the people across the Taiwan Strait that they are working against. And then you create that weird equivalence where politics is all bad, everybody is lying, is dishonest. So let's talk about other issues like the economy and the efficiency of a more authoritarian regime as well. So they're trying to depoliticize the environment in the Taiwan Strait. And again, if you look at the candidates that we suspect are receiving some support from Beijing, they're all on the same page that you don't want to talk about politics, you don't want to talk about democracy, it does not put food on the table, therefore let's talk about the means by which we can all enrich ourselves. So they're also saying that we no longer want to look at politics. In Taiwan, and Tsai government is repeatedly accused of only playing politics and enjoying being a critic of Beijing and all that, which is detrimental supposedly to the economy. For investigators like me and several others, there are several challenges as well. I mean, we don't have access, obviously, to classified material on investigations, especially when it comes to tracking finances and whatnot. So the best that we can do is accumulate circumstantial evidence, and there's piles of it, But I don't think it's sufficient at the moment to have an airtight case and take that to court and start pushing back on some of those organizations and activities. So what I'm repeatedly been calling for in Taiwan with very little success to date is for the government itself to fuse open source material with declassified material gathered by law enforcement and intelligence agencies and make a report that is accessible to the public so that they can actually make their case and demonstrate who's involved, the origins, the mechanisms, and then the impact on democratic institutions and elections. Because for the time being, you've had the government come out and say there's Chinese influence, but the public remains skeptical because they have yet to see the actual evidence of these activities. I think in that case, the Taiwanese government could learn a few tricks from the US government, especially following Russian interference in 2016. And I'm hopeful that that will materialize at some point. And then finally, while the activities targeting Taiwan are more immediate and intense given Beijing's objectives, much of what has been described above, with a few cultural and religious exceptions, they can also be applied against other democratic societies if the CCP deems that those are necessary to advance its objectives. In my view, disinformation, elite capture, and the use of various United Front Link front companies, dual companies and organizations, chambers of commerce worldwide, which benefit from a general lack of awareness on the part of targeted societies, will also be of particular concern in coming years. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions and reactions. Yes.
Quick question. You mentioned the efforts to work against or work for making the Taiwan populace lose confidence in its economic strength. What do you see them doing in terms of the security situation? More directly, military to military. Is there any kind of active, progressive attempt by the mainland side to convince the Taiwan public there's no point in resisting?
Right.
They're basically in the box.
Well, that's a long-standing strategy. I mean, there's also no doubt there's a serious problem of espionage in Taiwan, penetration of military establishment, security intelligence establishment, and all that. That being said, I sense that threat has been augmented by disinformation and psychological warfare as well, as a means to basically convince the Taiwanese that they cannot rely upon their military because they're completely penetrated. And also there's a component targeting the Americans in that, and I've heard that repeatedly, is like the Americans should not sell any advanced technology to Taiwan, i.e. the F-35, because the moment Taiwan receives that defense article, it's going to end up in the hands of the Chinese on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. I'm not quite convinced that Taiwan is penetrated to that extent, but that's certainly part of the psychological warfare operations. And as I said, the amount of Chinese PLA activity across the Taiwan Strait, across the Bashi Channel and Strait of Miyako in the past few years has accelerated tremendously. And occasionally, as I said, they would cross into median line or into Taiwan's ADIZ. And this makes big news in Taiwan as well. And you would always have the critics of the current government either accusing them of being ineffective or contributing to Chinese aggression because of their policies and all that.
Does the converse work? If the U.S. sails a few ships through the Taiwan Strait, does that embolden the Taiwan populace? What counter that?
The reception is overall quite positive, and it basically counters eternal fears that United States could at some point abandon them. Especially in the current context where, time and again we've been told that President Trump is transactional and all that. The fact that you've seen an increase in U.S. activity in the region, and we've also had a passage by French vessels. The French are getting a bit more involved in the region as well, is certainly sending signals of reassurance to the Taiwanese populace. And then that provides opportunities for people like me and others to remind the Taiwanese public that in the grand scheme of things, it's not just President Trump making decisions, but there's institutions back in Washington, D.C. as well that play a role in these things. And, the United States remains a democracy. You have a branch of Congress that is quite supportive of Taiwan as well. And that the notion that President Trump could one day decide that he wants to trade Taiwan for resolving the Korean nuclear issue, for example, it would not be that easy. And that, there's been a shift in recent years in DC circles, including at the State Department, that you've seen more and more people in those organizations that are amenable to supporting Taiwan and working with Taiwan. So those would all act as a counter to any abandonment should the executive branch decide to move in that direction. Otherwise, another means by which the Chinese have tried to undermine belief in Taiwanese military would be to bring retired military generals from Taiwan. All expenses paid trips to China to play golf, to attend conferences and whatnot. And then on a few occasions, Chinese CCP-controlled Chinese media would report things that the Taiwanese generals supposedly said, supporting unification, and that we would not even try to defend Taiwan should the PLA invade, only for the poor retired general to come back to Taiwan and say, I never said these things. So there's complicity of media back in China. The problem as well is that there's very poor corroboration practices in traditional media in Taiwan. So if something is reported in one media somewhere, chances are 24 hours later, every single media outlet will have reported the same thing, which makes countering disinformation all the more difficult on the part of the government, and which is another reason why right now disinformation is actually overwhelming the Tsai government, because not a day goes by without them having to counter different instances of disinformation, and you cannot respond to every single one of them. And the problem, and I've actually, Xu Zijian, the deputy foreign minister, has told me, he said there are days where the only thing we're doing basically is countering disinformation, especially when President Tsai was transiting in the United States and all that. But they said then it saps our resources, we no longer have energy to focus on the things that we're supposed to be doing. Right? That's another way that disinformation can be quite effective. And I would add that a lot of disinformation does not come only from China, but a lot of it comes from within Taiwan as well. And more we're seeing Chinese language disinformation on social media that seems to be generated by ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. And oftentimes the accounts seem to be fake, so there's probably bots or zombie accounts, but there's telltale signs such as no profile picture, no posts whatsoever, weird strings of numbers on Twitter or Facebook as the actual address for that particular page. But then they are using those to swarm different pages and critics of Beijing and all that. So there are signs of automation as well. Human involvement plus automation, so basically cyborg strategy targeting Taiwan. So that's some of the areas that have been involved in military in recent years. Yes?
Yeah, so you said something about disinformation and also the fears. Some people have the president setting up Taiwan together a nuclear deal with North Korea. I mean, we've seen that from before his inauguration when he called the Taiwanese
Right.
the leader. And,
Took a call from the Taiwanese president, right.
And all of US media went haywire because apparently to them it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And that's one part of this disinformation that I've seen going on over the years. And do you think the situation in Taiwan has any effects on the trade deal with China? Because I read this morning that the deal has come to a pause. The trade talks have come to a pause.
Right.
And I believe that could probably be a big factor. Do you think that's a factor?
Well, first of all, on the call, I don't think that was, the Chinese side probably tried to convince the world over that, it was a dangerous thing for Trump to take a call from Taiwanese president. When it comes to American media reaction, I think it stemmed mostly from media here being conditioned into regarding these things as destabilizing and a break with long-standing policies and all that. And I remember I was in London at the time, but I was asked by the New York Times to write an op-ed on that particular phone call. And I submitted it. It was in the middle of the night. I was jet lagged as always. And then I sent it, and they chose not to publish it. And I found out afterwards that was because I was not critical enough of President Trump. So there's also the biases in media environment in the United States at a time that, the certain media in the United States love to point to Mr. Trump's, inexperience and naivete and go it alone way of doing things. So you could not possibly say anything positive about anything that he was doing at the time, right? So I don't necessarily think in that case that was disinformation more so than an environment that basically supported or did not support President Trump. If I had been asked by a media outlet in the United States that supports President Trump, probably that my op-ed would have been first thing on their website. But unfortunately for me, it was the New York Times. As to the trade war. Well, there's certainly fears in Taiwan that the trade war is going to affect some of their companies. If that is, again, it's hard to see if Taiwan could be used as a bargaining chip for President Trump to get what he wants from the Chinese. And if he tried to do that again, I suspect that different branches of government would push back on this as well, right?
I mean, one of the reasons why I asked that is because I've seen in the media over the last 2 months or so, you have the Chinese always talking about the U.S. needs to start doing business with Taiwan, and it's been going on.
Oh, okay, right.
For multiple weeks, and that's why I asked, because they've really been handling that topic down in U.S. involvement in Taiwan.
You mean doing business altogether, or just selling defense articles?
Oh, sorry.
You mean just ending the sale of defense articles to Taiwan, or business altogether?
I think it was business altogether.
Okay, well, that's never going to happen because even under the One China policy in Washington, D.C., there's nothing that says that the United States has to stop doing business with Taiwan, right? It's not going to happen. There's no way that would. I mean, you could have some traction on ending arms sales to Taiwan, but ending business altogether. I mean, even the small countries that have de-recognized Taiwan and established ties with DPRC in recent years, the moment that the Taiwanese embassy was closed in that particular country and the embassy of that country closed in Taiwan, they would sit down and renegotiate unofficial organizations so that they couldn't continue trade and all that. I mean, trade is one of the rare areas where China has not really interfered in other countries' relationship with Taiwan. But the moment you touch on politics or defense, then they would step in. So if you try that with the United States, and Taiwan is the US's 14th largest trade partner, something like that. It's one of the more important trade partners for the United States, and don't quote me on 14, but it's
AIT just said 9.
9. Okay, well, see, it's even more important. And there's the economies are so interconnected as well in the chip making sector and other areas that to request that the United States stop doing business with Taiwan is a preposterous notion. Plus the fact that many of the companies in Taiwan that do business with the United States have their manufacturing base in China. So if China would be hurting itself as well if you say United States can no longer conduct business with Foxconn, well, you're going to have to find alternatives for all the components in the iPhones, for example, right? And that's a major. Foxconn employs 1.5 million workers in China, so you cannot. I don't see that scenario coming about.
I mean, again, it's all about this.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. But
I think the Chinese government is really against the FTAs or TIFA, this kind of
deepening or normalizing.
Or just spelling out some sort of sovereignty, sort of trade agreement.
That's a good point.
Do you see more co-opting of the Chinese academics to help MSS gather intelligence in Taiwan and beyond? Because the New York Times just had the article that was quite highly, that caused a lot of attention here, and also, what exactly are these relatively quite prominent Chinese scholars like Zhu Feng, Wu Baiyi. These scholars clearly were invited to Taiwan past as well. So another question is whether there's a need for intelligence sharing.
Right. Well, definitely there's a number of think tanks, including some in Hainan, that focus their research on South China Sea, for example, that are known to have recruited is perhaps too strong a term, but certainly I would say close to co-opted famous Taiwanese experts on the South China Sea in recent years, and they would actually feature them prominently in their websites, and these individuals would conduct joint studies with the Chinese and publish monographs and books that basically affirm China's or the PRC's claims to the entire South China Sea. That started again, these developments already were occurring under Ma Ying-jeou. What I've observed as well is not long before Tsai was elected, you could still find academics in China. Interview them in China or when they're traveling to Taiwan, they would say things that perhaps were not agreeable to Xi Jinping. I remember academics being quoted, prominent academics being quoted by Washington Post, for example, saying in the lead up to Tsai's inauguration, I don't think Taiwan needs to recognize 92 consensus for the relationship to continue to prosper, right? And soon enough after inauguration, all these academics went silent. And now more and more, actually, I myself don't travel to China, but I do have a number of friends in Taiwanese academic circles who are still able to travel to China, and they're increasingly telling me there's no point for them to go to China because they know exactly what the academics are going to tell them, and they could have read that in whatever speech Xi Jinping gave the week before, right? Now, whether these academics have been recruited or believe that, or they feel that they cannot depart from the official line in Beijing remains to be determined, right? Now, are some of them recruited by the Chinese authorities to conduct intelligence gathering in Taiwan? No, I don't have the evidence, but I would not be surprised if that were part of the deal as well, including business people. But to be honest, the Taiwanese do the same thing. Right.
I have a question. You paint a visible picture of what's happening.
I keep telling people I'm an optimist.
But what do you expect that the U.S. can do to help Taiwan in countering all this situation?
Right. Well, okay. First of all, actually, I wish I had the occasion to say that at previous speeches. Yeah, I present a fairly grim picture of the situation, but I also must emphasize that there's been other periods in Taiwan's history where the picture seemed dismal. The sky was falling. I remember, I moved there in 2005. There were different phases where people were like, "It's game over," right? Taiwan is also extraordinarily resilient. And I think ultimately, if they get some things right, they will be able to counter these kinds of activities as well. All you need is the political will and the right investment and continued support by international community and primarily the United States, which leads me to the second part of your question. Well, as I said, any signal of support on the part of the Americans, as we were talking about the transits in the Taiwan Strait, continued arms sales, more visibility for mill-to-mill exchanges between Taiwan and the U.S. And we saw that recently with a Taiwanese general having his photo taken at a meeting in Honolulu with the ROC Marines flag in the background and all that. I mean, these are all small things, but psychologically they certainly help boost morale in Taiwan and, help people realize that there's continued deepening engagement and all that. The fact that we're seeing now, we've had how many rounds of GCTF now? Is it like it's in a 24 maybe, give or take, joint training programs, bilateral efforts to bring senior American officials to Taiwan.
Over 30.
It's over 30 now? Okay, they've had many. From combating disease to media literacy to law enforcement, there's been different, and those started basically in 2015. So that's several of them in the space of a few years. Now the State Department's GEC is starting to sponsor some programs for bilateral ties. The fact that GEC has been such a successful formula that now you have other countries like Japan joining as well. So rather than being bilateral, it's becoming multilateral. Other countries, this is broadcast live, so I'm not going to mention other countries, but there's interest among other countries in the region as well to either join GCTF or to have their own similar formula to tackle issues like, cyber warfare, which are problems for all these democratic societies as well. So that growing alignment of interests on the part of the U.S. and Taiwan is having benefits in terms of positioning Taiwan as a more palatable partner for multilateral efforts as well. Now, there's a lot going on involving Taiwan, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States in promoting rule of law and democracy in Pacific Islands, which are currently targets of Chinese efforts to steal allies. 6 of them are official diplomatic allies of Taiwan. The countries like the US have every interest, for security reasons, for those countries to remain in the democratic camp and therefore official allies of Taiwan. So that has created all kinds of opportunities for joint efforts with Taiwan as well. The problem with this is that a lot of these activities, another thing last week, first time the FBI does its regional training for law enforcement, and it was held in Taiwan, and President Tsai was actually there to give opening remarks. And as I said, higher level engagement is becoming more visible, and that sends a right signal to Taiwanese society, and indirectly supports the Tsai government as a nod to what she's been doing. And I think it signals that Washington is quite pleased with the way she's handled things and cross-strait relations, but that ever difficult triangular relationship as well since 2016. I sense that we're going to see more of that as well in the lead up to 2020. The United States is not going to come out and explicitly say that they support a second term for President Tsai, but if you have more visible encounters and more senior visits and all that, that can certainly assist in that regard. But one final point on that issue, involving US, but other democracies as well, is that there's this agreement between Taiwan and partners that much of these activities, however constructive, need to be carried out quietly behind closed doors. Because these countries, especially middle powers and small powers, are afraid of Beijing retaliation. So as long as this is carried out quietly, that constructive engagement that allows Taiwan to further connect with the international community will happen. But if you had a government in Taipei that sought to publicize every of these encounters, I'm pretty sure they would dry up pretty quickly. So it's incremental. You're not going to have a major break or a signal of overt support. But I think it's the accretion or accumulation of all these little things that the Tsai government has been doing quite well. And I can tell you for a fact that, again, going back to Chinese academics and officials, they believe that they have Taiwan pretty much where they want it. But there is one thing that bothers the hell out of them in recent years, is that closer engagement with the United States. And they never miss an occasion to ask Taiwanese academics, officials, and foreign officials about that rapprochement and why it's happening right now. That worries them a lot. So I think it's a good sign for Taiwan. Thank you.